Good evening, all of you. Thank you very much, Mr. Govindra, for inviting me to your channel. Today, I would like to deal with the topic linguistic competency and linguistic performance. What is linguistic competency? Linguistic competency is the ability to know the grammar, the vocabulary, and other language items like prosodic futures and so on and so forth. Simply, it means that the ability to know the language. One who has attained the linguistic competence knows a lot about language. He knows a lot about grammar. He knows a lot about vocabulary. He knows a lot about pronunciation. And he knows a lot about functions. And he knows many things about the language. That is linguistic competence. Of course, unless you work hard, unless you learn many things in the language, you can't get linguistic competence. Slowly and surely, the linguistic competence will lead to linguistic competence. What is linguistic competence? The linguistic competence is the ability to use what we have learned in the form of a grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation, accent, intonation, other functions, and so on and so forth. So, though linguistic competency usually leads to linguistic performance, in most cases, it may not happen. Most of the learners of English as second or foreign language will stop at the level of linguistic competence or competency. They don't attain the required ability to use the language, that is linguistic performance. In language, it's not enough if you have the linguistic competency or competence, but you should have the linguistic performance. Unless you perform well in, in the language, in all occasions, or at least in some occasions, you can't be called a good user of the language. So, how should we correlate these two things? In order to make your linguistic competence help you to use the language well or to make you competent in using a language, you have to use language in living circumstances. You have to make the living English atmosphere as much as possible with your friends, with your relatives, in the classroom, in the staff room, and wherever you have the opportunity, you have to use it in the living circumstances. You can't acquire English or any language in unreal conditions, artificial conditions. It is better to speak English wrongly or faultily rather than to use it correctly in an artificial environment. Because language is living, there is no problem if you make some mistakes in the initial stages. Even though you may be excellent in grammar, you may make a number of grammatical mistakes when you are using it. Because knowing grammar is different from using the grammar correctly in your speech or writing. Of course, if it is writing, you have plenty of time to correct your mistakes. So you can write grammatically correct sentences. But in language or in spoken in communication, you don't have that time. You have to speak it. Speak the language spontaneously. So you tend to make some mistakes consciously or non-consciously. But you should aim for fluency in English in the first stage. Though you know that you are making some mistakes, you have to speak fluently because the three stages of using a language are fluency, correctness or accuracy, and appropriacy. You should never expect that you should use English correctly in the initial stages, even though you are good at grammar, even though you know a lot of vocabulary, even though you know many facts about language, because you have learned the language, you have not acquired the language like native speakers. Of course, native speakers do make mistakes. Making mistakes is a very common factor in using the language, especially in spoken communication. But here you are making mistakes, though you are grammatically aware of the many things. Why is it happening? Because it has not become a habit to speak spontaneously. Unless you know how to use spontaneously, you will tend to make mistakes, even though you are good at grammar. You may not use the vocabulary you know appropriately in the context because you're habituated to use them in the context. That means you haven't come to the level of linguistic performance. That's more important. So I advise all of my viewers to develop your linguistic performance, even though you have a lot of linguistic competence. It's not enough to have the competence, you should have the ability to perform well. You should attain linguistic com- performance. I mean, it's please don't never be satisfied with linguistic competence, but we should move from competence to performance. With this, I would like to conclude my lesson, once again asserting that you should move from competence, linguistic competence, to linguistic performance by